Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here at beautiful Bloomington, Indiana, at the Jacobs School of Music on the campus of Indiana University with Dee Stewart. I can't believe it's finally, coming to pass. Yeah. It's so great to meet you and to see you. We're here during the week of iTech 2014, where it all began, here at IU, and it's just an amazing thing to see so many wonderfully talented musicians playing the tuba, euphonium, and even the trombone, and a couple of trumpet players with the Boston Brass. That was great. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Obviously, you've been on my must interview list since I came up with this project. Largely because your book that was published in the 1980s, The Legacy of a Master, was, for me, very inspirational. Collection of essays by a number of leading brass artists. And this whole TPTV project is patterned after that book, really, in terms of just going around and getting everybody's little slice of the Jacobs pie, if you will. Obviously, hardly needing an introduction. Dee Stewart, longtime member of the Philadelphia Orchestra, 1962 to 1980, and you've been here at IU since 1980.
Yeah, long time.
Yeah, long time, and responsible not only for that book, but you organized hosted the International Brass Congress II in 1984, where Mr. Jacobs was the honoree of the conference, and of course, a longtime student of Arnold Jacobs. I'm wondering what do you remember about your initial encounters with Mr. Jacobs?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on these interviews. What a great idea, and we've seen some of them today, and I just think that's wonderful.
I should say we shared a couple of 3 sessions today. It was great.
A long time. Yeah. Well. I guess, what did we figure, 55, probably 1955 was when I first heard the name Arnold Jacobs, and one of the grad students that I was associated with told me about him and kept telling me that I should go take a lesson, and the story, everybody has that same story, I guess. Finally got up nerve to call him up. I think I was probably going into my junior year in college, and so I called him up, kind of tentatively, you know how it is, and he told me his address, 8839 South Normal in Chicago, and he told me how to get there and drive there and everything, and so I did, and it was quite an adventure for a young man to just do that, and park out in front of their house and go in and sit down with Mrs. Jacobs and listen to some student before me. And I remember 2 things from that first lesson. One is that he asked me if I understood anatomy. And my quick answer was, oh yeah, left hand, right hand. No, left hand, right hand. No, it wasn't quite that bad. But I actually said yes, and not realizing where it was going to lead me, because then he took off and verbalized things that I just couldn't imagine, and immediately presented a situation where I knew I was in the hands of a master. At that time, nobody that I had ever come across buzzed their mouthpiece. And he had me buzz the mouthpiece a couple, 3 times, and then play what we'd been working on, and it was immediately better. And I thought that was just fantastic. And I was so excited by that. I came back and had a rehearsal, and my girlfriend, who later became my wife, I couldn't wait for her to hear this. You gotta hear this thing, you gotta hear this. And I buzzed my mouthpiece, and her comment was, oh, what a horrible sound.
Yeah,
which I guess we don't quite realize how bad that sound is, but it's so important to us. but those are the things that really stick out from that first lesson, and of course from then on it just changed my life, like everyone says.
So we had the mouthpiece buzzing, and this leads. Let's, if I can just jump directly in. There's a fairly, I think, a really interesting story that you are known to tell, and this will be my first time getting to hear it from you. You were backstage. You had won your position with Philadelphia Orchestra, and you were backstage or somewhere, buzzing your mouthpiece, and some of your other brass colleagues of the PO were saying, "What are you doing?" And what can you?
Okay, yeah, this is maybe a little involved. Move me ahead if you need to, but in 1955, when I had that first lesson, like I said, nobody. I hadn't heard the name before. It was not common knowledge. And I think, people had studied with him, but not a great many people. And but he just, like I said, turned my life around. Within 6 months or so, I was playing professionally, and maybe a year or something like that, very quickly, and got in the New Orleans Orchestra and all that, and just felt that it was all, he was responsible for it all, and kept studying with him, of course, and he became very important in my life, and went to Northwestern with the intent of studying with him, and got my master's there, and then got in the Philadelphia Orchestra within just a short amount of time, a few years. I was 26, 1962, and I was just so proud of Arnold Jacobs and what our work had done. And so I was the youngest guy in the brass section, I think, or one of the two youngest guys. And so I mentioned his name a couple times, and to guys in the brass section, the old guys, and they knew about him, and they said he's a maverick, he's all wrong, he's doing things completely wrong, and he'll just ruin you. Well, I'm just this kid, so I just quickly shut up about Arnold Jacobs. That was in 1962. Jump ahead 22 years to 1984, when we had that brass congress here with 1,300 people, and he was the honored guest of the International Brass Congress, which I thought was a pretty big turnaround.
Yeah.
And a few years, right around that same period, I was on tour with the Summit Brass. Played with them a couple times, and one day we were getting ready to get on a bus to go to a rehearsal or concert or something, and of course the Summit Brass being all extremely fine players and all, and we were all just hanging around outside the bus. Every one of us was buzzing our mouthpiece.
Wow.
Which I thought was really, that Jake would be really proud of that.
Yeah, that is a big turnaround.
So in the 20 years or so, that 25 years, to my knowledge, I saw this single man, this one man, just turn us all around.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that, because I've heard Bob Tucci and some people talk about how over in Europe it spread.
Yeah.
And Bob can tell you which countries came first, and it's just swept through the world. And it's not just brass, of course. I think it affects the way that all wind players in particular, and maybe beyond, string players and everything, talk about the efficient method of producing sound.
So getting back to your early studies in the 50s and maybe into the early 60s, what besides buzzing and such, what else did he do for you?
Well, I was a bass trombone player at that time, totally a bass trombone player, solely, I guess is a better way to say it. And but he couldn't accept that necessarily. He said bass trombone is just a few notes down at the bottom. He said you're a trombonist, and we work on high notes as well as low notes. And of course, making music is the bottom line for everything, as everybody will attest to it. It was all about making music. But as a bass trombone player, working on the high range, I was having a little difficulty, and he wanted me to play a high E flat, like in the Reiner-era Symphony and that sort of thing. I couldn't do it. And so we were working on this one note, and now Jake only twice do I remember him swearing or saying anything harsh at all to me. I'll tell you about the other time too, maybe, if you were interested. But in this case, we were working on it, and it just couldn't happen. And he said, "Here, give me that goddamn thing." I'm pretty sure that's what he said.
Yeah.
And he reached over to pick up my bass trombone. So it's the one that's right over there. Now, you know how it is when somebody picks up your instrument. They don't know quite how to hold it, you know, and he's grabbing this thing, and you know, and I'm like, what's he doing, you know? This is my bass trombone. And he brings it up to his face, and I don't know if he closed his eyes, but it was like he closed his eyes. It was just a moment of just absolute silence, and then he took a breath and played this most beautiful high E flat on my bass trombone, which made me realize it wasn't the horn that was the problem. And I was very impressed by that.
Wow. What was the other time?
The other time was we had some kind of a etude or study that he had me do. Everything was pretty musical, you know, a lot of etude type things as opposed to exercises. And this one, I remember it was on the left-hand page. I don't know what book it was or anything, but it was quite technical and complicated, and had taken me a long time to work that up. And then it ended with just 5 or 6 cadential notes, maybe even half notes, quarter notes, just a 4, 5, 1 sort of thing. So I'm playing down, and I'm wailing, man, and I'm getting this thing really good, and I got all the way down here, and I got to those last 4 or 5 slow notes, and I just like bing, bom, 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 bom. I just kind of let them go, and I was like this, you know. And he just came up out of his chair, and he said, "Why'd you do that? Why'd you do that?" I said, "What? What? You know?" And he said, "Well, you just let those last notes go." And then he said, "Herseth would have never done that." And that full effect of that didn't hit me until really later, like in the Philadelphia Orchestra or something, because you listen to the concertmaster or the principal oboe, or they're waiting for those notes that they can really put some juice into.
Yeah,
you
just
know?
the intensity at the very end.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know, the technique and stuff is kind of an assumption.
Yeah.
But then when you get an opportunity to really make a phrase, take it.
Speaking of phrasing, did he work? Jake very famously talks about his time with Marcel Tebbuteau, and taking the musicianship class every year. He was allowed to, you know, as long as they would put up with him at Curtis. And there's the sub phrasing system. Did he ever explicitly talk about that?
No, but it's interesting you bring that up, because Tebbuteau had just left the Philadelphia Orchestra when I got there. I think he might have been gone a year, and so his phrasing and the Philadelphia Orchestra's musicianship and everything were really very well known and very acknowledged. And I think I fell into that niche.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's just the way the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Eugene Ormandy played. And a few years after I left there, came here, Keith Bryan was playing and had with an orchestra, just a small orchestra up in Michigan. I'm not sure Grand Rapids or someplace, and asked me to come up and play Bluebells of Scotland. And 2 shows, one in the afternoon and one in the evening, and at a rehearsal in the morning, and so did that. And between those 2 shows, we went out to dinner with several people. And he turned to me at one point and he said, you're the first player I've ever heard to play Bluebells of Scotland with tabby-toe phrasing. And it turned out that Keith Bryan had been a flute student in Philadelphia, or maybe at Curtis, and had followed tabby-toe's phrasing. So I'm not sure exactly what I did, but he caught that. I thought that was fascinating.
Do you think that you picked that up once you got into the orchestra, or is that something you picked up working with Jacobs? The way he would instruct you to phrase?
He didn't get into that kind of detail. He wanted you to make music, but to me, he didn't say crescendo where I was decrescendoing or something. It wasn't that particular. But it was all about making music. Just make music, say something,
Right.
Do something.
Right. Back in the 1950s with Reiner and into the 60s even, the CSO brass, wow. I mean, it was
amazing.
Just incredible. Those recordings even today are standard bearers.
Sure.
Do you have any recollections of CSO concerts from that time?
Yeah, we were there, and during the year that I was getting my master's, my wife and I applied for 2 tickets up in the balcony, and lo and behold, they put us right in the middle of the front row of the balcony.
Whoa.
And you could just flip a paper wad into his bell, it seemed like. So it was a pretty good place to sit. And of course, it was just great, as everybody says. The one thing that jumps out at me right now is hearing Petrouchka one time, and the big bear solo there. And I mean, it just ricocheted throughout the whole place. It was just amazing, and the reaction of the audience was what really got to me. The audience actually, what should I say, chuckled, laughed almost. I mean, it was so big and strong and
bearish.
Exactly. It was just, whoa, you never heard anything like that. But that really stuck out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now you saw him as a student, and I'm sure he was here in 1984, and master classes along the way. Did you notice anything that in terms of his teaching, his pedagogical approach, did it stay pretty much the constant, or was it ever changing? Or?
Well, yeah, a little hard for me to say that just from my single vantage point. Although I've heard people talk about it, and I've heard him talk over time, and I know he just was constantly studying. I know he got into more of the psychological aspects of it from his studies in later years. I think it started out as, I inquired of him how all this started a few times, and it had to do with the physical part, how the respiratory system worked, and how we can control it indirectly. But then I think he got into more of the psychological aspect a little bit later. But I don't have an awful lot of personal, nothing really strikes me. My work has evolved over time. And everything I do is related back to Jacobs. I've taught a lot of students, and over time, and especially lately, it last 5 years or so, I really delved more and more into making the music, and I have all my students play solos, and even if they're playing a Rochu or something, I want them to give me a title. What is this? Is this a sad song or happy song, or put a descriptive title on this thing? And that's and I'm getting away from exercises and things of that nature, and just trying to turn everything into music, which is what he wanted. You know, everything was, it was all musical. Music was the bottom line.
Yeah, it seemed to me that he had a musical solution for every issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That I encountered anyway.
And it goes back to the song and wind thing.
Mm-hmm.
The air is super important for me. Getting the air flowing. My pinwheel concept. It seems to be. If he'd have thought of a pinwheel, I think he would have just flipped out, because now you have to do it right. It's not just blowing a pinwheel. You have to do it right. But getting that air to flow and getting that efficient response of the air and the embouchure, and then turning that into music is primary.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're after.
I remember Mr. Jacobs being really just a consummate gentleman,
Mm-hmm.
and so kind, really thinking about the student, and
Mm-hmm.
but I know that there were some tuba players on the East Coast that perhaps had studied with him a little bit, or I don't know, that there were these stories that there was some friction, and I always wondered how could that be, and maybe I just didn't see a particular side of Mr. Jacobs. I mean, did you have any?
Well, not really. I was kind of thinking of what that reaction of the Philadelphia Orchestra guys when I first went there,
Yeah.
When we were speaking earlier. But even today, there are people who don't go along with this. They talk about tight gut and hard the muscle aspect of playing. And I mean, this, so let's say 1984, he's the man of the hour
Mm-hmm.
here, but this is 30 years later.
Yeah.
Exactly 30 years later, and I'm sure there's some people out there who still go in a different direction. That's pretty hard to come by now. I think most everybody is on his bandwagon, but there for a long time became a argumentative subject if you're not careful.
I think he would just be amazed at the level
Mm-hmm.
of performer that
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
we see today.
Yeah. Well, there were really great performers back before.
Yes.
And I think he would. I heard him use the term. Actually, I studied with one who had the opposite approach, and he said, "Well, you've learned in spite of him."
Right.
Was
Yeah.
his
Mm-hmm.
term. I remember that very well. And this guy had me playing with a tight gut, and he'd put his fist in my stomach and have me push it in and out and all kinds of things. So I came, I knew that area, but it just swept through the world, and it's almost easier to imagine something when you have when you can talk about certain things, certain parts of your body, you have a tight gut or something that I'm not doing this very well, but his concept is so simple that you get all the verbiage, and he can go for hours and hours and talk about everything, but when it comes down to what he told Phil Farkas that one time,
Right.
just turn off your brain and blow the damn thing.
Yeah.
So kind of along the line of that high E flat that he played for me, I was also working on a low note, and I'm a bass trombone player, okay? It was a low F, sixth position, and I don't remember what was wrong with it. It was something, the sound wasn't just what he wanted. What I remember was, he said, listen for the O in your sound. And I picked up my horn. Oh, there it was. What he didn't say was make an O, or he didn't tell me which muscle group to use, he didn't tell me what to do. He just told me what he wanted what to listen for.
Yeah.
Now that's pedagogy.
Yeah.
And it worked. It was immediately there.
We were talking at lunch, and I've posited this question to other people, most notably probably Henry Fogel, who used to be the president of the Chicago Symphony,
Mm-hmm.
and quite an audiophile. It seems to me that Jacobs and Herseth really changed the direction of music. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I think there's no question, and the Philadelphia or the Chicago brass was so well noted for their sound and their leadership in that role, and of course top and bottom was perfect. And if you were playing in that orchestra, you joined the gang, you know.
Yeah.
So and of course with Reiner and the Strauss recordings and things of that nature just led them right into that was perfect combination. Reiner had this little tiny stick, but it's interesting when you work with major conductors. They don't do very much. They don't give you a beat or something like
Right,
that.
right.
What they do is encourage you, draw out of you the music. Ormandy was, we had that delayed beat thing that was a problem for somebody when you just jumped in that orchestra on the first time basis or something. But what you had to do was listen. And he was making the picture. He was giving us the picture,
Mm-hmm.
and we all had to come as a group together and solve that picture. And when you come from different settings, you're looking for a beat or something, and Reiner had hardly any movement at all, and yet he's looking around and he's watching and he's wanting people to turn on some music here.
Yeah.
And let him know what it was he wanted. So I'm sure he was very well aware of the brass section that he had to work with, and he's just saying, "Come on, boys."
Yeah, and those recordings, they were distributed around the country and to a certain
Mhm.
extent around the world.
Mhm.
And so people would hear this
Mhm.
really phenomenal brass section. They would come to Chicago and want to get a
Mhm.
piece of it, and they'd get a lesson with Mr. Jacobs, and
Mhm.
they'd go home and
Mhm. Yeah.
and teach their students, and
Exactly. Yeah.
it really was an amazing time.
And it encompassed the world
Yeah.
in a short amount of time, couple of 3 decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And-
This was before the internet.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah.
I mean, they started before automatic teller machines were invented.
Well, I remember he used the word computer. He would talk about the brain being the computer.
Yes.
And we didn't have computers. What's he know about computers?
Yeah.
But we knew the term, and we knew the concept that is out there someplace,
Yeah.
But he latched onto that term, and how you program the computer,
Program the brain.
get it done, and then just press go.
Yep.
And press play, and let your body use that information that
Yeah.
you've got programmed up there.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
That's cool. Dee, earlier I mentioned what a great inspiration your book, Legacy of a Master, was for me as a college student at Northwestern and a student of Mr. Jacobs. I just ate up every single essay, and some really resonated with me personally because of the issues
Mhm.
that the authors of each essay noted. Can you tell us just how did that? Why do you think
Yeah.
he never wrote a book himself, and then
Right.
just how did you get started in that whole
Okay,
process?
sure. Yeah, well, everybody wanted him to write a book or do something.
Yeah.
I mean, those of us who'd studied with him just came back with glowing reports, and soon after all that, people wanted documentation. What did he say? What's this all about? And so when I came here in 1980, a few years after that, I guess. Well, no, let's back up. So when I was taking lessons early on, before Philadelphia and so forth, my girlfriend, who this was before computers again, she, in her studies, we were both in college, in her studies she would use 3x5 cards to take notes on, and then she'd put them in order and so forth, and write her dissertation or whatever it is she was after. And so she would come with me to Chicago, and she would sit in on the lessons, and she'd sit over there in the corner, and she's writing what he says the whole time. And that went on for years, and she kept them. And when I think probably kind of after I initially got in the orchestra and so forth, I'd kind of, accomplished something, and so one time we were with him, and she had a stack of those cards, like, I don't know, 2 inches thick, seemed like to me, with a rubber band around them. And she handed them to Jacobs, and she said, "Here's your book." I mean, it seemed like a gold mine for him. Here's everything, And he took them, but he said, no. He said, "That's Dee's book, my book." And he said that doesn't work for Mike, it doesn't necessarily work for Mike, doesn't necessarily work for Joe or anybody else. It's
Buttles.
There you go. It just works for Dee.
Yeah.
And he said, if I write Dee's book, then Mike picks it up, and it doesn't necessarily apply, and it might even be the wrong thing. I'm putting some words in his mouth there, but that was the idea.
Yeah.
And so it just bothered everybody that we couldn't get a book out of him. So then, fast forward, I came here and had an opportunity to take my first sabbatical, I guess it was, and needed a project. And so I'm thinking, how can we get something out of this? And it suddenly dawned on me that if he's not going to write a book, let's skip that process and let's go to the students of him and see what they got out of him. Can we bring it out that way?
Yeah.
And so I approached him about that, and he was okay with that. He liked that idea. And then I asked him for a list of students. By then there were hundreds of students. And I remember we were on the phone, and he said, "Oh my, there are so many." I remember he said it that way. But he gave, I knew, of course, several people, and we kicked it around a few times and came up with a list. I don't know how deeply you want to get into this, but it was quite interesting. I got contacts for everybody and wrote them letters, not before email, and several of them didn't know me. They didn't know what I was trying to do. What do you they wanted to protect Jake. They didn't want some person out there who, shouldn't be authorized to do this sort of thing.
Right.
Others caught on immediately, but it took some suggestion to get that through. And I learned a lot. I learned that you need to give them a deadline. And some of them asked that. They said, if I don't have a deadline, I'm never going to get this done. Tell me when you want it. So that was that part of it. I learned a lot because a lot of the people wrote about things that I'd never heard him say. And that's because Dee's book, Dee didn't have that problem, only Joe had that problem.
Yeah, he didn't talk about that.
He didn't talk about that problem with me. And so, whoa, I mean, this affected my teaching, and because I had students that had those problems. I didn't know what they were. You know? And so I ended up with a document, an unpublished piece of paper. I sent it around to some publishers, including the Brass Press, I believe. Hope I'm quoting that correctly. Nobody would publish it. I think I sent it to Shermer, different, I mean, it looked great to me. and they called it an orphan. They said it's not a biography, it's not a method book, it doesn't fit on our shelves any place. So I copied it. I think we had Xerox by then or something, and I was ready to send it to Jake just as a gift.
Sure.
And Jim Reiner, the publisher of The Instrumentalist, was going to do a special thing, monthly magazine on Jacobs. And somebody mentioned that I had some material. And so he called me up, and I said, yeah, I got some. I didn't have any hopes for anything at that point. I'd pretty much lost all hope on that. And I sent it to him, and two or three days later he called me back and he said, this is a book. And I said, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how it was. And,
wow.
But this publisher, Jim Reiner, it's got to be exactly right. What the guys had sent me were writings from a brass player, which are not necessarily perfect.
You had to do a lot of editing.
Grammatically and all sorts of things. So he had to go through, he went through everything.
Wow.
And I started reading and I said, well, yeah, okay, that's grammatically right, but I know what that guy's saying and that's different, you know? So I remember sitting at the kitchen table, I had three piles. I had the original, I had the publications edits, and then my suggestion of how to solve those two things. So it was a big project. But I thought they did an excellent job with it.
We're back now. Just it occurred to me there must be a copy of this book in Mr. Stewart's office somewhere, just so we could show it. It's just a wonderful collection of essays, and you I think you probably had something else to add to your.
Yes. Well, I sent one to Jacobs, of course, and I was just really proud of the way the Instrumentalist presented it in hardback form. It just looks really good. They didn't charge very much for it. I was just really pleased with their handling of it. I didn't know really quite what we were getting into, and then I talked to Jacobs, and he said that he and Gazella read it together, it sounded like, and he said it was just like visiting old friends. And so I was very pleased with that. Shortly after that, Phil Farkas was teaching here, and as a colleague of Jacobs in Chicago and Herseth, the three of them, were really quite strong, and I thought it would be neat to do similar projects on them. And I spoke to this time I started with the publisher, and I spoke to the publisher, and he was all for getting Phil Farkas to do something, to write a book about him. So I handled it pretty much on the same way, and when I contacted people, now they knew what it was all about because they had this. And so now people wanted in,
Right, after the fact.
So we had no problem getting people. But yeah, that's pretty much the story of the book, and it's now currently out of print. I'm got to push on the publisher a little bit.
Yeah, I think it'd be great.
Yeah.
Were you involved at all in the famous Gabrieli recording? What memories do you have of that?
Oh, that was pretty amazing. That was pretty early on. I hadn't been there too long. Still a kid, and the year before I got there, they had a brass quintet. Gil Johnson, Seymour Rosenfeld, Mason Jones, Henry Smith, and Abe Torchinsky. And we were recording for Columbia Records at the time. And Columbia had come up with this idea of a brass quintet with jazz rhythm section. Okay?
It's far different than the final product.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so there were arrangements made, and they made the recording, and it came out, and the guys were really proud of it, and they thought it would be nice to present a copy to Mr. Ormandy, Eugene Ormandy.
Hmm.
So they made quite a deal. They walked into the office and he looked at it and said, well, it's wonderful. And he's looking at it. This is an LP. And he said, why, this is jazz. This is jazz. Philadelphia Orchestra does not do jazz. And he pronounced it that way.
Yeah.
Consequently, some of the recording people lost jobs. It was pulled off the market, and you can't get a copy of it.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
That was the year before I came. So I heard this story when I got there. That's how far things have come.
Yeah, yeah.
And we did play a couple gigs. I played a couple gigs with it. Not very good music, actually. It's really hokey. But anyway, but Columbia was very interested in this brass quintet for some reason. And so for some unknown reason, I really don't know the answer to this, they decided to bring me in as a euphonium player, make it 6 people, which was interesting,
Mhm.
sound-wise
Mhm.
and things, you know. And we made 5 anyway recordings that are out there. You can get them on CD now. Very good recordings. 2 with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, one of Christmas and one of hymns, and then 2 or 3 really serious brass pieces with 6 people. And what we would do, we'd kind of take the euphonium and tuba parts and sometimes drop out the tuba, which would make for a whole different sound. Then he'd come in maybe an octave lower than me if I were playing the bass part. And
This was all preceding the Gabrieli.
I think so. Yeah.
Wow.
Or maybe the Gabrieli came in there someplace.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, yeah.
but anyway, we never performed.
Mhm.
We just recorded, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And so then, what was his name? Anyway, Columbia came up with this idea of Gabrieli, antiphonal music, and they were working with Chicago, Cleveland, New York, and Philadelphia. Columbia were recording all those orchestras, so they wanted to get 3 of them, the brass sections from 3 of them involved in these antiphonal things.
Mhm.
And the only one time in the whole year that they could find a spot where you could get 3 of those orchestras together was New York was busy on that one spot, so we got the 3, Chicago, Cleveland, and us, and we all had a Friday afternoon concert that was over at 4 and a Saturday night concert. And so Chicago and Cleveland, as soon as their 4 o'clock came, they got on an airplane, flew to Philadelphia. We had a recording session that night, another one the next morning, the next afternoon, and they flew away, and that was it.
Wow.
With no conductor, we didn't tune,
Mhm.
just major players sitting down and playing.
Did you have any interaction with your former teacher, or
Uh,
not even really former?
Not
but,
much.
not
I
too-
mean, it happened so fast,
Yeah.
there was no time. I remember we went out in between, I guess, the Saturday noon session. I happened to be sitting next to Dale Clevenger, and we had a nice discussion. Now Dale's here.
Yeah.
So Dale from Chicago Symphony is teaching with me here. Myron Bloom from the Cleveland Orchestra is teaching here, and I'm teaching here. So there's one representative from each orchestra.
Well, that's such an amazing
Yeah.
recording.
And it came out on LP, and of course it's antiphonal, but it's 3-way antiphonal
Mhm.
most of the time. And I couldn't figure out how that was going to work, and I couldn't. That was the one thing I was really interested in, and I remember getting the LP and sitting down in front of the 2 speakers in my house, and you could hear the one group here, one group here, and son of a gun, there's a group coming right out of the middle, right out of the blank wall.
How about that?
I mean, it was so well balanced. And so we got 2 Grammys for
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
One for best chamber music of the year and one for the best engineered of the year.
It's great.
It was
Well,
amazing.
I'm so glad to get that information about that recording, and it's such a monumental
Hmm.
disc in the history of brass playing.
Yeah.
And during our time together, just these over the last 24 hours, I've been learning of Mr. Stewart's impending move. He's downsizing, and generally speaking, Puddles instructs me to give a token of our thanks and appreciation, which I have with me, a genuine University of Oregon tumbler.
And that's like my low F.
That's like your low. Listen for the O.
Mhm.
See.
Mm-hmm.
But the last thing he needs is more stuff in his house. So, what he's instructed us to do is to take this over to iTech and just give it to a student roaming about.
That would be wonderful. Compliments of me and you. Yeah, great. Thank you. That was a pleasure. So I wanted to tell you about my little house that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Is on a small lake, and the name of the lake is Wind Song.
You're moving to a lake named Windsong,
Yep.
and you can't buy that.
That's right. Oh, I got it. Yeah,
Thanks so
I
much,
thought that
Dee.
was tremendous. Yeah,
It's
thank
really,
you.
really
I
great to meet you
enjoyed it.
and spend time with you.
Well, your work is fantastic. Keep it up.
Thank you very much. And now back to you.